What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup, even though the fact that I do so makes some people really mad. But if you're not wildly irrational and what I do here sounds like a rip-roaring good time to you, then I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join us back here each week. I mean, honestly, if you're into true crime and makeup, I don't really see a different logical option, but ball's in your court now. If what we do here, though, is not your jam, feel free to head on out to a corner of the internet that you might enjoy more. But for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Okay, so you guys remember a couple of weeks ago when I said this? Right. So have you guys ever been researching a case that you thought was a different case and then halfway through you're like, hey, wait a minute, am I researching the completely wrong fucking case? Well, today we're going to be covering the case that I'd initially thought I was researching when I'd first started accidentally researching Nicole Vanderheiden's case. And that, my friends, is the tragic story of the death of 15-year-old Nicole Vanden Hurk. Yeah, that whole wires crossed, accidentally researching the entirely wrong case thing hopefully makes a little more sense now. I guess I had typed Nicole Vande into Google and then just blindly committed to the autocomplete. So thanks for leading me astray, Google. I'm just kidding. Y'all saw my YouTube paychecks, so meager as they may be. Love you. Anyway, why don't I quit getting completely sidetracked and actually finally tell you guys this story. All right, so for today's story, we're actually heading out of North America and across the Atlantic to somewhere that I honestly can't remember if we've ever been to before. And that is the Netherlands.
Nice try. You see, the Netherlands is this make-believe place where Peter Pan and Tinkerbell come from.
However, while the Netherlands is in fact a real place, and it is where the bulk of our story takes place today, we first have to travel about 100 kilometers southeast to where our story begins. Nicole Vanden Hurk was born on July 4th, 1980 in Erkelenz, Germany, to her mother Angelica Tegmeyer. Yeah, pronunciation today gonna be rough. Erkelenz is a small town located in western Germany. It hosts a population of just shy of 45,000 people. It sits on 117 square kilometers of land, and it is best known for its agriculture, its castle, Ziegelweier Park, and the Church of Saint Lambertus. Oh, and it's Germany, so like obviously there's a bunch of breweries and beer-related activities to indulge in there as well. Unfortunately, though, what it is not known for is a very stable time for baby Nicole. As previously mentioned, Nicole's mother was a woman named Angelica, and regretfully, she was not exactly the most stable presence for her daughter. Despite that fact, though, and the fact that she could barely even look after herself, for the first bit of Nicole's life, Angelica was really all that she had, considering that Nicole's biological father, he was never involved in her life in any capacity. Sans for, participating in the devil's tango that led to her conception. Actually, I don't even think Angelica knew for sure who Nicole's father was until she was almost 1 year old. I can't say for certain why then or what prompted it, but it was right around Nicole's first birthday that Angelica decided to submit for a paternity test regarding her daughter. And ultimately what this DNA test revealed was that Nicole's biological father was apparently a man from their neighborhood that was very much married. He was married and he already had a family of his own, which is why he never really wanted to have anything to do with raising Nicole or with having a relationship with her. Thankfully, though, before things were able to get too out of hand in Angelica and Nicole's lives, Angelica happened upon a man named Ad Vanden Hurk, whom ultimately she fell hard and fast for. And Ad actually turned out to be a very stable and very reliable and positive presence in Nicole's life. It was definitely a good thing overall that Ad and Angelica's relationship moved as quickly as it did. Not only did they move from Erkelenz to Eindhoven before they'd even known each other for a year, but they also went ahead and got married shortly thereafter making that move. And while I'm sure this seems fast to most people's standards, they were both really serious about each other. They both had children, and they were both looking to provide a united and stable environment. And for a while, their relationship seemed to be incredibly happy and incredibly healthy. Angelica even ended up changing she and Nicole's last name to Ad's following their marriage. A gesture that Ad undoubtedly appreciated and certainly deserved, considering the fact that he was the only father figure Nicole ever knew. As far as I am aware, he basically stepped up from day one and he took Nicole on as if she was his very own. He treated her no differently than he treated his own son, Nicole's new stepbrother, Andy. And basically this love and acceptance, it really helped to foster a healthy little blended family unit. At least at first it did. Unfortunately though, the good times didn't last forever when it came to the Vanden Hurks, because no matter how hard they tried, they just could not seem to get a handle on Angelica's rapidly declining mental health. Yeah, as the honeymoon phase and the novelty of her new marriage and new family dynamic wore off, Ad and the kids started to notice that Angelica's moods, they were fluctuating rapidly. From one moment to the next, you never really knew what you were going to get with Angelica. She had high highs and she had very low lows. And this caused a lot of tension within the family because everyone felt like they had to walk on eggshells around her. And what's really sad is that Angelica, she absolutely noticed this change in her family, but she just didn't have the energy or the mental bandwidth to fight to get them back. Rather, all she felt like she could do was voluntarily isolate herself more and more. And my guess is that given the time period we're in, like the mid to late 80s, I have to assume that there just were not a lot of treatment options available for whatever exactly Angelica was struggling with. I mean, I don't feel like mental health really became something that everybody cared so widely about until like 10, maybe 15 years ago. And so without the access to the help that she so clearly, desperately needed, her mental health just continued to unravel with each passing day until eventually she was holed up alone in her bedroom, like 24/7. Over time, she became totally reclusive. She was withdrawn and detached from the family, and she was obviously deeply depressed. Honestly, it's really sad to think about like how deeply she was clearly struggling and how few resources would have likely been available for her at the time. I mean, I've been there and I really do feel for her. She was obviously going through it. And to the extent of my knowledge, Ad really did try to be there for her. He tried to be understanding. He tried to help her. He probably didn't have a lot of resources, but he did the best that he could. But when someone is that far gone, I don't know, it's hard to turn that around without professional help. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's hard. Which is why after just shy of 10 years together, he threw in the towel. He had really held out hope and tried to believe that things were going to get better, but after years of watching his wife deteriorate right in front of him with little to no signs of any possible improvement, he finally decided that he had to get the kids out of that house. Sure, as hard as it would be for them to be separated from Angelica, watching her self-destruct under the very same roof as them, well, Ad was really afraid of what that might do to the kids long term. And so, with, I assume, a very, very heavy heart, in 1989, Ad filed for divorce as well as for sole custody of Nicole. Obviously, he didn't have any biological connection to her, but for all intents and purposes, she was his daughter, and he was not about to abandon her with a woman that really couldn't even take care of herself anymore. And after hearing Ad's argument for sole custody, a judge actually agreed that Nicole would be better off in his care than she would be in Angelica's. Therefore, Ad was awarded full custody of his stepdaughter. And this was actually a huge relief for Nicole. Sure, she loved her mother, but it would be naive to think that their relationship hadn't taken on at least some damage over the years that Angelica had been struggling. Obviously, kids, especially back then, didn't understand the magnitude and the seriousness of what mental health issues could do to a person. And so without sounding insensitive, Nicole was kind of just relieved to know that she wasn't going to end up becoming her mother's caretaker by the time she was a teenager. Again, I want to stress that I don't think this was because there was any love lost between she and her mother. I think there was just some resentment there, stemming from a lack of understanding as to what her mom was really and truly going through. I mean, at the end of the day, she was a preteen girl going through a massive shakeup in her life. I think it's understandable that she didn't want to be separated from her brother or her father, and she didn't want to give up her chance at life just in order to take care of her mom. And I do want to make it abundantly clear here that I'm not trying to cast judgment on or to villainize Angelica. Trust me, you will soon see that whatever she was dealing with was really serious. Like, I don't think she wanted to be an absentee mother. I think that she just truly could not handle whatever she was going through. And then, I mean, take me out of the equation. When it's posed to you like that, I feel like it leaves the door open for judgment on Ad. Like, wow, he just took his kids and abandoned Angelica when she probably needed him the most. It's just, there's not a good answer. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at here. I simply think that this, unfortunately, all took place during an era where mental health just was not understood and it wasn't taken that seriously. And this left Angelica with very, very few options. And given the situation, I really think that Ad did what he thought was best for the children at the time. It's not like they got in one fight and he was like, come on kids, we're out of here. He tried for years to keep the family together, but in the end, I guess he just felt that the best chance they had at a normal life was solely with him. I really don't know why I've gone off on such a tangent with this, but I can just easily see people wanting to pass judgment on either Angelica or Ad or both of them. Bottom line is, it was a different time and there's really nothing we could do or say to change what happened. This is just how things played out, and I don't think it's fair, not having lived this ourselves, to pass any sort of harsh judgments on to anyone involved in the situation. Trust me when I'm sure that everyone that's still around has spent decades ruminating on if they should have done things differently. But they didn't. Angela hit rock bottom. Ad couldn't pull her back up. The kids were being negatively impacted by her condition and her mental state, so they moved away. Like I said, Nicole was incredibly happy to still be with Ad and Andy. They were the only real stable family she'd ever known, so she was thankful and relieved that she got to stay with them. Really, the only downside of the arrangement was that now Ad was basically a single parent. Ad, who traveled a lot for his job, now needed to find reliable care for Nicole and Andy whenever he needed to go on a work trip. Luckily though, his mother was more than willing to help with this. Whenever he had to go out of town, his mom happily opened up her home for the kids and took them in to care for them in Ad's absence. That said though, Ad didn't actually carry the title of single parent for all that long. As a matter of fact, it was actually while on one of the aforementioned business trips that Ad ended up meeting a woman named Jolanda, whom he actually went on to quickly marry. And listen, we're gonna be hitting the evil step-parent trope real hard next week, but as far as Nicole's experience with step-parents goes, she seems to have won the lottery both times. Not only had Ad turned out to be an incredible father figure for her, taking her in when he had no real obligation to, but Jolanda also turned out to be a wonderful stepmother to both Nicole and Andy. So for seemingly the first time in either of the children's lives, they had two stable, responsible, and loving, hardworking parents. Now, Jolanda was in the same line of work as Ad was, hence the whole meeting on a business trip dealio. So although Ad was technically no longer a single parent, the family dynamic and the kids' frequent stays with their grandmother, none of that really changed. Nevertheless, though, they were happy. The same of which could, sadly, not be said for Angelica. She struggled a lot in the wake of she and Ad's divorce, which, unfortunately, I really don't think anyone's gonna find all that surprising. After things had fallen apart, she kind of always held out hope that if and when she was able to get her mental health in order, she and Ad could kind of pick up where they left off. She really and truly loved that man. Despite the struggles she went through, her time with Ad was the happiest of her entire life. So when she found out that he not only moved on, but that he'd also already remarried, well, this apparently destroyed whatever was left of Angelica. She simply just could not handle how massively her life had imploded right before her very eyes. And devastatingly, she really didn't see any way from that point on that she would ever be okay again. So, in April of 1995, Angelica Vanden Hurk, she took her own life. She finally succumbed to a lifetime of mental health turmoil. Obviously, there's no way for me specifically to know how exactly this all impacted Nicole. Like, there's not a lot of specifics available surrounding how she took the information or how it affected her, but I think it would be safe to say that it was definitely hard for her. Despite the fact that she'd been estranged from her mother for, I think, going on 6 years at this point, she had still always kind of hoped that someday they would get a chance to rekindle their relationship, that Angela would get better and Nicole would grow up, and that when the time was right, they could come back together and they could have the sort of relationship that you would expect a mother and daughter to have. Sadly though, now that could never be Nicole's reality. Yeah, she had a complicated history with her mother, but that certainly did not make grappling with or accepting her death any easier. In a way, with so much left unresolved, it might have made it harder. Sure, Nicole tried to keep herself busy in the wake of her mother's passing, but it was evident to everyone, especially to Ad, that Nicole was having a very difficult time. And so Ad, once again being the super dad he is, when he saw just how much Nicole really was struggling, he actually took it as a sign that maybe it was time for him to step back from his incredibly demanding job so that he could be there and support his grieving daughter. Sidebar, I believe he worked in the music business. I don't have a lot of specifics, but I feel like I keep beating around the bush about this like elusive, demanding job. But quite frankly, it's because I don't really have any information on it. Regardless though, he ended up taking a bit of a break from the more demanding aspects of his career in the wake of Angela's death in hopes of helping support his daughter through this devastating loss. And I respect Ad a lot for this, because I cannot even imagine losing my mom now, let alone when I was a teenager. Obviously, there is a stark contrast between my mom and I's relationship and Nicole and Angelica's lack thereof, but still. There's also a stark contrast in growing up with the thought that your mom could rejoin your life at any moment and growing up knowing that she can't and never will, you know? And wow, even somehow through all of this, Nicole still managed to remain a sweet and friendly, well-adjusted kid. She never got in trouble. She did well in school. She was popular. I mean, she was friendly with everyone. She had a boyfriend. She was clearly freaking stunning. So while she had her fair share of hardships throughout her life, she also did have some parts of her life that were going really well. Shoot, a lot of kids who went through what she had probably would have turned to alcohol or drugs or, I don't know, some other unproductive avenues to distract themselves from what was going on in their lives, but not Nicole. Her idea of a distraction after Angelica's death was to get a job. She quite literally chose to be more responsible in the aftermath of her mother's death, which, I don't know, I feel like says a lot about who she was. I don't know that that would have been a lot of kids' first instinct, but evidently it was Nicole's, because she got a job working as a seasonal holiday employee at a little bakery inside of a nearby shopping center, and because she wasn't driving yet, she would ride her bike to and from work. She was only 15, so this was the most reliable form of transportation she had. And she did this for weeks with, I assume, no issue. So I have to imagine that when she set out on her bike, heading to work early on the morning of Friday, October 6th, 1995, neither she nor her family could have ever imagined that that would be the last time that they would ever get to see one another. Ever again. Like I said, Nicole was incredibly responsible. She never missed work. She was never even late for a shift, at least not as far as I'm aware. So when she completely failed to show up for her shift at the bakery that morning, her boss knew immediately that something had to be very, very wrong. He was actually so freaked out by Nicole's absence that he straight up skipped over calling Ad or Jolanda, and he immediately just went straight to the police. So it actually ended up being the police that informed Ad and Jolanda that Nicole was missing. They reached out to them after Nicole's boss had reported her absence. They asked them if they knew where she was, which they didn't. And from speaking to them, it did not take them long to also come to the same conclusion as Nicole's boss, that something was not right. Especially considering that when Nicole's grandmother had last spoken to her, Nicole had bid her adieu when leaving the house for work. Meaning she had clearly intended on making it there, so where the hell was she? A cursory search for Nicole was initiated pretty much immediately. It started mostly with a foot search of the area, and police were not only looking and hoping to find Nicole herself, but they were also questioning anyone and everyone they could find to see if anyone could recall seeing or speaking to Nicole. They gave Nicole's description as well as a detailed description of her bike to as many people as they possibly could that afternoon, but unfortunately, each and every time, they were met with the same response. Not a single person seemed to have seen her, and no one seemed to have any idea where she could be. It was truly like she had just disappeared into thin air. It was chilling. The idea that a 15-year-old girl could vanish like that, without a trace, in the middle of the day? It's a 40-year-old story from halfway across the world, and it still gives me chills. As does the image of the first trace of Nicole police did eventually stumble across. It was around 6 p.m. the evening that Nicole disappeared when police made a very ominous discovery. It was while they were out searching for Nicole that one of the officers happened upon her bike, half submerged in the nearby Dommel River. Now, fortunately, or at least they thought so at the time, they didn't find any of her other belongings with her bike, which left some room for hope in at least the officers' heads that perhaps Nicole had ditched her bike and headed off on foot somewhere on her own accord. Like, they thought that maybe she'd decided to run away. And I can sort of understand how they came to this theory. I mean, she had obviously been struggling. She'd been through a lot leading up to this, so I guess it's not completely outside the realm of possibility that a teen who's struggling emotionally might run off for some time to themselves. However, when Ad was approached with this theory, he shut it down immediately. Police posed the question to him of if Nicole might have wanted to run away, or if maybe she had other family that she might have taken off to see. And while she did have some extended family off in Germany, Ad was vehement that the idea of Nicole taking off to Germany on a whim, he said it was out of the question. But regardless of how sure Ad seemed in his assertion that his daughter would not have left on her own volition, police still in the back of their minds kind of thought that, like, she'd most likely run away. And yes, I am aware that we've talked about this before, but man, do that be chapping my ass. When these police, who have never met a kid a day in their freaking lives, look at their parents and tell them, like, oh, well, they probably just ran away. Like they know their kids better than them. Thankfully, in this scenario, the theory that Nicole had run away didn't stop them from continuing to search for her, so I guess I'll at least give them that credit, because I cannot for the life of me remember what video it is that I went off on this tangent before, but unless society is ready to change the legal age of adulthood to 13, 14, 15, what have you, there is simply, in my opinion, no excuse to write off runaway cases as if they're not as important as other missing children's cases. If we don't think that children of this age range are equipped to function solo out in the world, then whether they took off on their own or not, it should still be a high priority to track them down. And like I said, thankfully the police did keep their foot on the gas in searching for Nicole and keeping her case going, even if in the back of their minds, they thought they were right. At the end of the day, they knew that Ad knew Nicole, and he knew her temperament, and he knew her personality, so I guess they took his intel as being pretty reliable. Sure, everyone keeps secrets from their parents, especially throughout their teenage years, myself included. Sorry, Mom. But even with all of the shit that I did behind my parents' back and all of the secrets that I kept from them, my mom still would have told police that I would not have ever run away, and she would have been absolutely right. Just because I was out drinking in a field with my friends somewhere when my parents thought I was tucked into a sleeping bag surrounded by my girlfriends did not inherently make me a flight risk. And while I understand that there are exceptions to everything, I'd still be willing to bet that the vast majority of parents, at the very least, know whether or not their children would ever truly attempt to run away or not. And sadly, less than 2 weeks after Nicole disappeared, it would become painfully obvious to everyone involved that she had likely not run away, via her own free will. And that is because police found her backpack, complete with all of her personal effects, abandoned near Eindhoven Canal on October 19th, 1995, just 13 days after she was last seen. And while it was possible that Nicole could have ditched her bike to run away, it was much less likely that she would have ditched her backpack and her money and stuff if she was really trying to make any progress heading back to Germany or wherever police thought she might be trying to go. Yeah, no, this discovery really kicked the investigation and the search for Nicole back into high gear. Police tore that canal and the surrounding area apart for days, hoping to find additional clues as to what could have possibly happened to Nicole, but by the end of the month, I think it was like October 29th, their search had yielded little to no additional information other than Nicole's backpack. Now, that's not to say that the investigation was slowing down by any means. Quite the contrary, actually. Over the following month, after Nicole's bag was discovered, police received upwards of 300 tips regarding Nicole and what had happened to her, but sadly, none of the information that they were receiving left them feeling very optimistic. Most of the calls were pretty vague. There wasn't like a ton of original information coming in with each call, but one thing did remain pretty steadfast through most of these tipsters' calls, and that, unfortunately, was that Nicole had supposedly been murdered. And while I think police were likely coming to this conclusion on their own around this time anyway, it was still incredibly discouraging for them to hear, especially since most of the calls were really just vague. Like, to my understanding, most of them were just like, yeah, she was killed. Click. And after about 100 or so of those, how helpful really is that information anymore? Now, they did think that they were getting somewhere right at the tail end of October when an anonymous man called the police station and told them that he could actually identify Nicole's killer, which obviously this would have been massive for police and for the investigation. But just after this person told police that he knew who killed Nicole, the line went dead and police were never able to get any real information out of their mystery caller. A couple months later, when they were really grasping at straws, they did decide to broadcast the recording of this call across national TV in hopes that someone might recognize the man's voice, but they were never able to identify him, therefore they were never able to track him down. They also looked into some reports of some teens, some kids.
Youths!
I don't know how old they were, but whomever they were, they had apparently been terrorizing people on bikes real close to where Nicole's bike had wound up being discovered. But once they questioned the kids, they pretty quickly ruled them out as just like neighborhood rascals rather than criminal masterminds. And this, once again, led them back to square one. And this was a really, really stressful time, not just for Nicole's family, but for just the community in general. Even with Ad publicly doing his best to remain calm and optimistic, stating in an interview once, quote, "If this ends badly, I can always collapse then," his stoicism really didn't do much to ease the fears of Eindhoven as a whole. I mean, the news was covering Nicole's story seemingly non-stop. It was like the town couldn't go an hour without being reminded that a crazed lunatic could be on the loose abducting young girls. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. Good for the media for keeping Nicole in the forefront of everyone's minds. I'm just saying that people were bugging, and rightfully so, because on Wednesday, November 22nd, 47 days after Nicole had disappeared, a man passing through a wooded area between the village of Mierlo and the town of Geldrop, well, he made a horrifying discovery. There, on the ground, surrounded by fallen leaves and foliage, lay the lifeless body of Nicole van den Hurk, frozen in time and forever 15. Understandably, this tragic end to Nicole's story absolutely rocked Eindhoven and the surrounding area. So much so that at her funeral service, which was held about a week after she had been discovered, over 1,000 people turned out to honor her and to support her family and just to grieve her loss. Even people who didn't know her were torn apart by what had happened to her. I mean, she was 15 years old. She had her entire life ahead of her, and it was snuffed out like that, just brutally and in the middle of the day. And as if that wasn't bad enough, then she was just thrown aside like trash, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from her own grandmother's house. It was just unfathomable to everyone. Nicole's autopsy revealed numerous injuries, further proving that she had been through absolute hell in her final moments. Her jaw was fractured, there was notable trauma to her head, she had a broken finger, she'd been stabbed so deeply and brutally that her ribs had been injured, she'd been violated. I mean, it was just sick what this monster, whomever they were, had done to her. The only thing that could rival the horror of what this sicko had done to Nicole was the fact that he was still at large. Like, police had nothing. They were no closer to figuring out who was responsible for Nicole's death than they had been the day that they had pulled her bike out of that canal. I mean, investigatively speaking, it was just such a different time. Forensics and crime scene investigation and honestly, everything was just so different back then than it is now. Like, imagine the difference in 1990s cell phones versus cell phones now. That alone is mind-bending, and that's probably nothing compared to how far forensic science has come over the last 30 years. Yeah, everyone wanted Nicole's killer brought to justice, but unfortunately, at the time, they just didn't have a lot to go off of. And while I can understand how difficult it must have been to try to solve these kinds of crimes back then, I can also completely empathize with Nicole's family and their displeasure with the progress, or I guess lack thereof, being made in Nicole's case. I'm sure there was more going on behind the scenes than they were really aware of. I think that's the case a lot of the times. But from where the family was sitting, all they were seeing was police interview either them or people that they were seemingly choosing at random. The family was so desperate for a break in the case and so desperate for answers that at one point, Jolanda actually sought out the guidance of a psychic, but not surprisingly, the information provided by this person did not pan out into anything worthwhile. Nor did a pretty baffling lead that came about in February out of Miami, of all places. Don't get me wrong, if something buck wild's gonna come up over here in the States, best believe it's probably gonna come out of Florida, but still. For a lead in a murder investigation in the Netherlands to pop up 4,600 miles away in freaking Miami, Florida, I don't really think anyone saw that coming. Wouldn't it be great if I told you what the lead was instead of just speaking in backwards riddles about how unexpected it was? I will tell you about it, but first, I need to take my break and throw on my lashes quick. But when we get back, Miami. Don't go nowhere. Okay, so we're back, and just before our break, the investigative team in charge of Nicole's case got a very, very surprising lead out of an even more surprising location. Basically, what had happened was this woman, let's call her Celine. Well, her name is Celine. I don't know why I said it like that was an alias, but anyway, Celine. She was a local woman to Eindhoven. However, come February 1996, she finds herself detained in Miami for drug trafficking. And in some sort of, I guess, like Hail Mary to strike a deal with police, she claimed that she had been forced into this trafficking situation by some pretty shady men. Shady men who also just so happened to be responsible for Nicole's murder. Yeah, dude, it was nuts. Crazy as it was, though, people actually really seemed to buy into this theory, at least at first. Actually, Ad, Nicole's stepdad, he really seemed to be like gung-ho about this theory once it had made its way back to Eindhoven. Frustratingly, though, after sufficiently investigating this, police determined that there just wasn't any validity to it. They couldn't substantiate the information that Celine was giving them, and ultimately, they weren't able to find any sort of tangible link between Celine's employers and Nicole's death. And this actually led police to make a very unexpected and frankly pretty frustrating decision. Essentially, they thought that because Ad had been like so hopped up and interested in Celine's story, police determined that this had to mean that Ad was looking for someone to pass the buck off onto. As in, they believed that his eagerness for them to look into Celine was actually just a disguise for his eagerness that he actually felt for them to stop looking into him. Yeah, after the whole Celine thing fell apart, police arrested not just Ad, but they arrested Andy too. And y'all, when I tell you that they did not have a leg to stand on when it came to making these arrests, I mean, they did not have a leg to stand on when it came to making these arrests. There was not a single ounce of evidence on either of these men to link them to what had happened to Nicole. Truly, I don't even understand how they managed to get clearance to arrest either of them. Granted, this is all happening in a different country, and I don't really know what the protocols are or what burdens need to be met before you're allowed to arrest someone in the Netherlands, but I have to imagine that it's something more than him. Now, thankfully, they were both released relatively quickly. Like I said, there was quite literally no evidence to even sort of implicate them into what had happened to Nicole, which makes me double down on the fact that they never should have been arrested in the first place. Yes, I fully understand that family and those closest to a victim are always going to be heavily scrutinized in a situation like this. But to arrest them and to parade them through the police station and to interrogate them as official suspects without even a shred of evidence against them, yeah, it's a swing and a miss for me, friends. This poor family is already going through the most traumatic experience of all of their lives. But yeah, let's compound on that for no reason at all except for the whisper of hope that we have that we can fit a square peg into a round hole. It's so dumb. And unfortunately, from there, Nicole's case went unresolved for decades. The investigation lost steam, people lost hope, the team of detectives assigned to her case dwindled down, and eventually everyone was forced to just move on. Andy moved away to England, Ad and Jolanda divorced, and he moved to Spain. I think she stayed in the Netherlands. I mean, I don't have any idea exactly what the catalyst for the divorce was, but I did read somewhere that basically everyone in Nicole's family seemed to have a different view on how to handle losing her. Plus, I feel like a majority of the time, relationships don't survive tragedies like this because grief is hard on people. Obviously, we know that everyone grieves at their own pace, but I think if those paces are too different, then it can be really difficult for 2 or 3 or however many people to ever get back onto the same page. I think the statistic is that something like 80 to 90% of couples split up after they lose a child, which is a mind-blowing statistic, but it's also believable and it's understandable. And that's not to mention that I think Jolanda was Ad's fifth wife anyway, so he was no real stranger to divorce as it was, but I guess that's really neither here nor there. I only bring it up because once you've done it 4 times, it's probably easier to make the decision than it is the first or second time. That's totally speculation on my part, by the way. I hope to never personally know how any of that feels. Bringing it back to Nicole, though, I guess once the case went cold, Ad really wanted to move on and to just let it be. And understandably, this really rubbed Andy and Jolanda the wrong way. Andy in particular was hell-bent on trying to find out what had happened to his sister and to seeing that whomever was responsible was brought to justice. Especially as the years went on and technology advanced, Andy felt like every couple of weeks he was hearing about another cold case being solved thanks to these advancements. And he felt like if all these other cases are being solved years or even decades later, why couldn't Nicole's be solved too? Actually, a cold case team did end up looking back into Nicole's case in, I believe, 2004, but they didn't end up making any headway on it. So fast forward to 2011, and Andy, he'd had enough. He simply did not feel as though he could go even one more day without some sort of progress being made in Nicole's case. It had been 16 years, and he was frustrated. He was sad, and to put it bluntly, he was over it. And this amalgamation of feelings led him to make a pretty wild public statement about his sister's case right onto his personal Facebook page. The statement read, quote, "I will be arrested today for the murder of my sister. I've confessed, and I will get in contact soon." Yeah. Prior to writing out that statement, Andy had in fact contacted local investigators and turned himself in, confessing to authorities that he was the one responsible for killing his sister all those years ago. Bet you didn't see that one coming, huh? Yeah, neither did anyone who knew Andy or who had known Nicole. I mean, to say people were shocked, well, that would be a massive understatement. Andy had always loved his sister. He had doted on her. He protected her. He could not possibly have killed her. Could he? Well, sure enough, shortly after posting that Facebook status, Andy was in fact arrested and extradited from England back to the Netherlands in order to face his freshly earned murder charges. Now, obviously, he wasn't surprised by the arrest. He didn't fight the extradition, and he didn't even mind sitting in jail following his confession. He was more than happy with where he was. He was content behind bars. And that was all because he knew something that no one else did. His confession was 1,000,000% bullshit. He didn't kill Nicole, just as everyone had always thought. He would never have hurt a hair on her head. He loved his sister, and he had never wanted anything other than the best for her. Which begs the question then, why on earth was he sitting in jail for her murder completely and totally on his own volition? You see, Andy knew that once he confessed, police would have to re-examine his sister's case. They would be essentially forced to find at least some link between he and what had happened to his sister in order to corroborate his confession. And he knew full well that that link, it didn't exist. Basically, his hope was that when they began re-examining what had happened to Nicole, if all went according to plan, perhaps this false confession would ultimately lead to the discovery of who had actually killed her. Now, this was definitely a very roundabout way to try to facilitate said chain of events. Oof, and risky. Let's not forget that. This was an incredibly dicey plan. There was every chance in the world that reopening Nicole's case would leave investigators just as empty-handed as they'd always been, thus leaving them with nothing in the world to go off of other than Andy's confession. And if that happened, shit, let's call a spade, he would have been screwed. Thankfully, Andy ended up only being jailed for under a week, I think like 5 days to be specific. That's how long it took police to realize that there was a massive lack of evidence for this. And that's because there was none, because Andy was innocent. Unfortunately, though, by the time that police did turn Andy loose, they still hadn't found any additional evidence to point them in the direction of the real killer. Yeah, so much to Andy's dismay, with each passing day, it started to seem more and more like he had stuck his neck out in vain. He had risked hard prison time in order to avenge his sister, and now it was looking like he was right back where he had started. But if we know anything about Andy, which at this point, I think we do, it's that he is not giving up on his sister. Not that easily. So, as soon as he felt as though the life his confession had breathed back into his sister's case started to fade, he did the only logical thing he could think to do next, which was to implicate his own father. Yeah, dude, Andy is wild. As soon as he felt like the investigation was starting to stall back out, he went straight to police, and he was like, hey, remember how I just told you that I did this? Well, that was actually just a ruse to get you to look into my dad, because he's the real killer. Yeah, he went from pointing the finger at himself to accusing his own father of raping Nicole, impregnating her, and then murdering her to cover it all up. Yeah, feel free to pause for what the actual fuck. Everyone had always been so confused as to why Ad was so quick to try and move on from what had happened to Nicole. Was this why? Did he want to sweep under the rug that he had been sexually abusing her? Did he want to bury the secret of their illegitimate child along with his own stepdaughter? I mean, that was the question that everyone was left with now. And the answer? Absolutely not. Just like Andy, Ad was 1,000% totally and completely innocent. The only difference between Andy's confession and his implication of his father was the level of detail. And what I mean by that is that Andy's confession had merely prompted police to review the information they already had. But these allegations against his father, mainly the possibility that Nicole could have been pregnant, well, that was a whole new ball field. Sure, it was unlikely that they'd missed a pregnancy during Nicole's first autopsy, but regardless, the claims had to be either proven false or substantiated. And the only way that they were going to be able to do that was if they exhumed and re-examined Nicole's remains. And I'm sure it will come as a surprise to precisely none of you that this had been Andy's angle right from the start. From the moment he made his own confession, this was the outcome he'd been after. He wanted his sister exhumed. He wanted her remains re-examined. He wanted investigators to apply all of their new technology and methods that they'd come up with in the last decade. He wanted all of it pointed at his sister's case. He wanted so badly for something that they weren't able to utilize 16 years ago, some infinitesimal little speck of forensic evidence, to now be the thing that brought his sister's killer to justice. Nicole's body was exhumed for testing in September of 2011, and while I don't know if they had any real, concrete expectations of what they would or wouldn't find, I can tell you for certain that Andy's hopes were sky freaking high. He had all of his eggs in this basket, and against all odds, within the same week that they dug her up, police announced that foreign male DNA had in fact been removed from Nicole's remains. Isn't that nuts that they can do that almost 2 decades later? I have said it before and I will say it again. Science, fucking amazing. As was the fact that with this announcement and with the newly renewed interest in Nicole's case, police had actually started receiving tangible and promising leads again, all these years later. Not surprisingly, none of these leads in any way, shape, or form implicated Andy or Ad, nor did the DNA they'd recovered. Rather, that had come back as that of an unknown male. It did not match Andy, it did not match Ad, it didn't match Nicole's boyfriend from the time. It undoubtedly belonged to the killer, and it effectively cleared up all of the suspicion that Andy had clouded he and his father in an effort to solve his sister's case. Honestly, though, I don't think Andy was ever really all that worried about that to begin with. He knew he was innocent. He knew his father was innocent. Despite the lack of progress that he'd seen in his sister's case up to the time of his confession, he truly believed that with the right motivation, police would not only be able to prove that neither he nor Ad were responsible, but he also truly believed that with the advances in science and technology and forensics that had come about since his sister's death, he was all but certain that police could and would find who was responsible for her untimely end. He just needed to give him a reason to dig her up. He had seen so many cold cases solved over the years, thanks to these innovations in forensics, and he knew that if he could give police a reason to dig his sister up and to look her over, that they could undoubtedly solve her case as well. What is incredibly frustrating, though, is that from the point of them exhuming Nicole's body to actually solving her case, that would still take years. It wasn't until late 2013 that the cold case team in charge of Nicole's case started making some undeniable connections between a rape case that they'd come across from 2000 and what had happened to Nicole 5 years earlier. In the Y2K case, September Y2K to be specific, the perpetrator in that case had forced a young woman off of her bike at knife point before taking her to a remote area where he would ultimately go on to rape her. Sound familiar? Yeah. Because this case was so similar to what had happened to Nicole, right down to the victim being snatched off her bicycle, it gave police enough probable cause to warrant an official comparison between the DNA from the guilty party in the Y2K case against the DNA taken from Nicole. And finally, after 18 years with no progress, 18 years with no answers, and 18 years with no closure, they got a name. 46-year-old Jose Deji was arrested on January 14th, 2014, after his DNA linked him to the rape and murder of 15-year-old Nicole Vandenhurk, almost 20 years later. Jose was a serial rapist, having been proven to have committed at least 3 separate rapes over the span of his miserable life, in addition to what he'd done to Nicole back in '95. Now, he was at one point tried and convicted of at least some of his sex crimes, and he had been sentenced to 3 years preventative detention and compulsory treatment for at least one of the offenses. Clearly, that was a smashing success. Jose first appeared in court for his charges pertaining to Nicole in April of 2014, and during this hearing, his defense team tried desperately to undermine the DNA evidence that the prosecution had against him. I mean, obviously they would want that tossed out. It was the strongest piece of evidence they had against him. So they went in and with their whole chest and 10 toes to the ground began arguing that because there was also DNA from Nicole's boyfriend found on her, who's to say that she and Jose didn't have consensual sex and that her boyfriend wasn't the one to rape and murder her? Yeah, I guess when you're caught all but red-handed, you really don't have any choice but to just grasp at the finest of straws. But I don't know, what really pissed me off from that point was that his defense team went on to basically disparaged Nicole's name by arguing that she had numerous sexual partners and that given her promiscuity, it could have been any number of men who had raped and murdered her. They felt as though there was no way to be sure that it was Hose. Obviously, that argument is preposterous on its own, but then couple it with his statement later that he had never met nor engaged in sexual contact of any kind with Nicole. We're getting a lot of mixed signals here, my guy. Don't worry though, his defense team kindly clarified that he didn't mean that there was no way for sure that he'd never had sex with Nicole. Rather, he meant that if he had had sex with Nicole, he simply didn't remember it. Yeah, apparently he lived like a rough, transient, unstable kind of life. Shocking, I know. He was frequently out, sleeping around, I guess, and because of this, there were plenty of past sexual exchanges that he couldn't entirely remember now in the present day. Meaning that he wanted everyone to believe that his memory was good enough for him to say with confidence that he didn't kill Nicole, but not so good that he could say with confidence whether or not he'd ever had sex with her. You gotta love that selective amnesia. Hose trial began on November 2nd, 2015, with the prosecution arguing that 20 years earlier, Hose had kidnapped Nicole off of her bike in the middle of broad daylight before raping her and killing her and tossing her body and bike as if they were trash. They held firm that Hose was responsible and that they needed little beyond the DNA that they'd extracted from Nicole's body to prove it. Altogether, they had pulled 3 separate DNA samples off of Nicole's body that ended up matching back to Hose. One was from Nicole's underwear and the other 2 were from her lower region. And that seems like pretty damning evidence to me, but conversely, the defense argued that because Nicole's body had been exposed to bacteria and to the elements for like 7 weeks while she laid in the woods undiscovered, that by the time they extracted the already degraded samples, basically they felt as though there was just no way to ensure the integrity of the samples that had landed their client in prison. Yeah, it was a real he said, they said type disaster. Well, that is until a witness came forward for the prosecution, alleging that Hose had actually confessed to them that he'd once killed a girl. And since Nicole was the only girl that wound up dead that police knew was somehow linked to Hose, well, they didn't really have to stretch before they made the leap that this confession was in reference to Nicole. Woohoo! And y'all, did this send the trial into a motherfucking tailspin. They actually ended up having to suspend the proceedings for like 2 weeks, smack dab in the middle of the trial, to try and verify the validity of this witness's statement. Obviously, the prosecution was hoping that this was going to be like the final nail in the coffin against Hose, but the defense was certain that the witness's testimony was solely motivated by the €15,000 reward that was available for any pertinent information relating to Nicole's case. Unfortunately, though, despite the hopes that the prosecution had that this testimony would help to bolster their case, ultimately, it was just this witness's word against Hose. Honestly and truly, it looked like the one and only thing that the jury was going to have to go off of was going to be the DNA. And so it was announced in March of 2016, like 3-4 months after the trial had initially begun. That's when it was decided that the DNA would, once again, be analyzed using the most up-to-date methods available to hopefully, once and for all, prove the validity of the findings. Overall, 5 different, widely renowned and completely unbiased scientists were contracted to look over the DNA and to provide their individual conclusions. Independent forensic scientists R. Eikelenboom, J. Klaver-Koopman, and T.J.P. de Blage of the Netherlands Forensic Institute, J.S. Buckleton of the Institute of Environmental Sciences and Research of New Zealand, and M.W. Perlin, Chief Scientific Officer of Cybergenetics. Between the 5 of them, several different computer software programs were used to analyze the DNA using statistical methods, otherwise known as probabilistic genotyping. Y'all, I'm gonna need a nap after this video. Especially considering that after all of this mind-numbing, hardcore science and the results of this testing came back, it was inconclusive. Yeah, literally all of that. For nothing. Basically, they were left with nothing beyond the original DNA match that had led them to arrest Hose in the first place. For what it's worth, though, that result wasn't nothing. I think it showed that it was something like 2 million times more likely that the DNA belonged to him than to anyone else, which, like I said, that's not nothing. Still, though, I have to imagine that as the jury deliberated, oh God, Nicole's family must have been on pins and freaking needles. I mean, it seems so obvious to us, like, yeah, it was him. But once those jurors get behind closed doors, I don't know, man. You can never be too confident. Thankfully, though, on November 21st, 2016, Hose was found guilty of Nicole's rape, which was obviously a huge relief. However, said relief was short-lived because in the same breath that they found him guilty of her rape, he was acquitted of her murder. Or I guess technically manslaughter is what they were going after, but regardless, he was acquitted of any responsibility for her actual death. Yeah, dude, talk about a gut punch. Here's the kicker, though. He got 5 years. Yeah, 5 years. People were pissed. Like, what are the realistic chances that he raped her, but then someone else just so happened to murder her right after? Be so fucking for real right now. And it wasn't just Nicole's family or the public or me here now that refused to accept Hose's acquittal. Pretty much as soon as his initial trial ended, the prosecution began the process of trying to appeal the acquittal. In their appeal, they demanded that the initial sentence they'd sought of 14 years imprisonment be imposed ASAP. I guess 14 years was the absolute max they could go for, given the situation, so that's why they'd gone after it initially and gone after it on appeal as well. And let me just point out that the whole notion of the prosecution being able to appeal an acquittal, bananas to me, since here in the States, that's not an option. You know, double jeopardy. If you're acquitted, you're acquitted, whether the prosecution likes it or not. So yeah, the prosecution being able to fight Hose's acquittal, to me, nuts. But what's even crazier is that it went through. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad. In my opinion, he is clearly guilty, but living somewhere in the world where this would not have been an option, and then seeing a case that not only was it used, but it was also successful. Hose's acquittal was overturned on October 9th, 2018, just shy of 23 years after Nicole's life was senselessly and brutally taken. He was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison, a sentence that would be upheld in 2020, despite Hose's attempt to appeal the prosecution's appeal, meaning that for now, and for at least the next couple of years, Hose de remains behind bars where he very clearly deserves to be. Like, he's so appallingly disgusting, and it frustrates me to no end that he's managed to hurt as many people in his life just so far as he has. Also, it really pisses me off that his identity is like such a mystery. I don't even know if Hose de is his real name. As far as I know, that is an alias that the sources that I referenced while researching this video named him. And despite the hours that I spent scouring just the farthest, darkest, deepest corners of the internet, I was not able to find a single picture of this shit sandwich that was not this one with his undoubtedly beady little eyes covered. Even after his conviction, he has never owned up to what he's done. He's never showed an ounce of remorse, and he has never apologized to the family. Just nothing. Not even public pleas for a confession from Nicole's family after Hose's conviction did anything to speak to the black hole that's where his heart's supposed to be. Ad once stated during an interview, quote, "Only when the perpetrator confesses will we have a little more peace in the final days of our lives." But sadly, I personally doubt that that day will ever come. And then moving on to something completely devastating. Andy, hero Andy, the big brother that stuck his neck out to finally bring justice to his sister, he would never know peace ever again. Andy struggled so deeply with his mental health after his sister died, and although he basically single-handedly got her case solved, he was just never able to find himself again. Even in the wake of Hose's identification and conviction, he still struggled daily with his sister's death, among other personal demons that I doubt any of us will truly ever understand the depths of. All I know is that after posting one final Facebook post on August 27th, 2021, a post that read, quote, "I am ready to say goodbye. The pills will do the rest." Poor Andy, he took his own life. And that is just something that I don't think we can ever put enough focus on, is how these crimes affect not just the victim, but how it can completely destroy members of their family too. Sometimes to the point where they quite literally cannot go on, like in this instance. And it wasn't just Andy, although he was clearly hit the hardest by all of this, but Nicole had other siblings too, whose lives were also completely turned upside down by what this monster did. She had a stepsister named Debbie, who was 6 at the time she was killed, and during an interview about Nicole years after her death, Debbie was quoted saying, "My childhood changed drastically since Nicole's death. Instead of playing outside, I went to the psychologist because of my separation anxiety. I sneaked into my parents' room at night to keep an eye on them so that they wouldn't just disappear from my life." Like, oh, dude, it is just so sad that Nicole's life was cut short and Andy's life was cut short and Debbie's childhood was essentially cut short. Not to mention the pain and anguish that Ad and Jolanda and Nicole's other half-brother Tommy have all had to endure over the years following her death. It's just really fucking sad. Obviously, that's not the most eloquent phrasing, but sometimes the simplest terms are the most profound. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked in the description. And if you're also into the makeup aspect of these videos, I will make sure to have all of the details and the links for everything I used throughout today's video listed down there as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos almost every week, so if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! Sure. Dude, I can't even... Okay, Nat, bitch, nobody invited you here. Oh my god, what? Stop. Stop. Breathe, bitch. Okay. Da-da-da-da. Oh, son of a bitch. Relatively every freaking time with this. Shit. Fuck, I hope that didn't break. Well, ain't that some shit? He had seen... Jesus Christ. Shows was... I don't know how to say it. Bitch, where the fuck are you at? Why am I like that? Why is that my reaction to everything? And, okay.